believe in forgiving or forgetting?
I don't know when exactly it started to feel like I was attending these family game nights more out of obligation than any real desire to spend time with them, but somewhere between my 35th birthday and my dad's increasing forgetfulness, I started showing up mostly because I knew no one would notice if I didn't, except my mom. It was one of those traditions that just kept going because it always had, like Sunday meatloaf or putting the plastic tree back in the basement after Christmas. Every Thursday at 7 sharp, no matter the weather or whatever else life had going on, we all sat around the kitchen table, pretending we still enjoyed each other, pretending we hadn't grown tired of the same conversations, the same jokes, the same tired roles we'd each been assigned decades ago. And that particular night, the one that changed everything, was no different. At first, I arrived 5 minutes late, as always, balancing a tray of spinach dip I knew my dad wouldn't touch and a cheap bottle of wine my mom would pretend to love. The door was already open, left ajar by Ben, my younger brother, who'd probably breezed in 10 minutes early with his too loud voice and that know-it-all energy he wore like cologne. The hallway smelled like a mix of lemon-scented pine sol and whatever cheap tobacco blend Dad was still smoking, despite 3 different doctors telling him to cut the crap. I stepped inside, and as usual, no one greeted me. Not really. There was a half-hearted "Hey Cass" from my mom in the kitchen, already half buried in a baking sheet of frozen pigs in a blanket. Dad was at the table, shuffling cards for a game no one had voted on, like he always did. Ben had his feet up on a chair and a beer already cracked. And I stood there for a moment, just soaking in how completely unnecessary I felt in that house. It's funny. You spend your whole life thinking if you just work a little harder, get a little quieter, stay out of the way, maybe eventually someone will notice you're bleeding. But all it gets you is an assigned seat at a table where no one remembers what color piece you usually play. I put down the food, poured myself a glass of wine, and settled in across from Ben, who immediately launched into some story about a pitch he made at work that impressed his boss so much he got pulled into a confidential meeting. I smiled like I cared, like I hadn't heard some variation of this same story for the last 15 years, and nodded in all the right places. Dad laughed too loud at a joke I didn't understand. Mom tried to change the subject to something safe like whether my succulents were still alive, and I sat there, waiting. I didn't know for what. Maybe for someone to ask about me. They never did. The game we played that night was some trivia card set Mom bought at Target, probably hoping it'd spark conversation. Know your family or something cutesy like that. One of those games designed to make you feel connected while you're quietly dying inside. Each card had a question. Who in the family is the best cook? What was Dad's dream job as a kid? Who's most likely to win an Oscar? All meant to be lighthearted, feel-good prompts. Except in our family, they were just grenades with glitter. Ben answered loud and proud every time, managing to make every question about himself, and somehow everyone let him. Then came the question that should have been harmless. My mom pulled it out and read it with that fake cheer she wore when trying to keep things light. Who in the family has done something truly impressive? She paused. No one spoke. Ben looked smug. Dad didn't even think. He laughed, a deep, wheezing, old man laugh that used to scare me when I was a kid, and said, without even glancing at me, well, definitely not Cassie. She's never done anything impressive anyway. He said it like a joke. Like one of his harmless barbs. The way he used to say I was built like a librarian, or that I had a personality like wet paper. Everyone laughed. Even Mom, though she tried to stifle it. I didn't. I just sat there, my glass of wine half full, my mouth full of 1,000 replies I'd been swallowing since I was 12. I didn't say a word. Instead, I got up slowly, calmly, like I needed to stretch or maybe check on the food. I walked into the kitchen and opened the pantry, pretending to be looking for chips or napkins or something else to keep my hands busy. But I wasn't thinking about snacks. I was thinking about every single moment in my life where I'd swallowed my pride just to keep the peace. Every time I'd bitten my tongue when Dad belittled my work, my looks, my choices. Every time Ben got applause for doing half as much as I did. Every single time my mom smiled apologetically at me but never said anything to stop them. I was thinking about the time Dad didn't show up to my college graduation because Ben had a thing and no one questioned it. Or when I got promoted last year and no one even bothered to call. Or when I spent my 30th birthday alone and my dad sent a group text that read, "Happy birthday, kiddo," as if that was enough. I stood there in front of the pantry shelf, my hands shaking just enough for me to notice, and I realized something I hadn't let myself believe before. It wasn't just that they didn't respect me. It was that they didn't see me at all. I could vanish from this family, and the only thing anyone would notice was who'd bring the damn spinach dip. That's when it happened. Not an outburst, not some dramatic scene. Just a click inside me, something subtle but seismic. The kind of shift that doesn't make a sound but changes everything. I didn't walk back into the dining room right away. I stayed there, leaning against the counter, staring at a half-empty bag of pretzels and thinking about how much power you could have if you stopped caring whether people approved of you. I thought about the difference between being silent and being invisible. And I thought about how sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one yelling, but the one smiling, planning, remembering. I went back in with the pretzels. I didn't slam them on the table or call anyone out. I just set them down, sat back in my seat, and looked across at my dad, still chuckling at his own joke like it hadn't shattered something inside me. I smiled. Just a small one. Enough to make him feel comfortable. He had no idea I was done. Not with the game. With all of it. And the thing about being the invisible one is, no one sees you coming. /. The strange thing about that moment wasn't the insult itself. I'd heard worse from him, in harsher tones and with sharper words, over the course of my entire life. It wasn't even the fact that he said it in front of everyone. Not caring whether or not it humiliated me, because that was his nature, loud and careless and amused by his own cruelty. What stayed with me, what hung there in the air long after the pretzels were passed and someone cracked another beer, was the way no one reacted. Not really. No pause. No discomfort. Just that awful, automatic family chuckle, the one that always rises up to smooth over tension like a sloppy coat of paint on a crumbling wall. That laugh, that collective choice to keep going, was louder than the insult itself. I sat there afterward, listening to the pieces of conversation pick up again like nothing had happened, and I sipped my wine like a woman watching her own funeral. I looked at my mom, pretending to adjust the oven timer as though she hadn't heard a thing, her back rigid in that apron she wore every Thursday like a costume. I looked at Ben, who was now scrolling through his phone with a smug smirk, not even bothering to pretend he gave a damn about the people around him, and then I looked at my dad, who had already moved on to arguing about baseball trivia, his eyes bright, his shoulders shaking with laughter that belonged to a man who believed he still had complete control of the room. And in that moment, something long dormant in me, something patient and quiet and always overlooked, began to rise. It didn't burn, it didn't boil, it settled, like sediment in water, thick and undeniable. And as I sat there, still nodding at the right times and pretending I was fine, a thought came to me so clearly it was almost like someone whispered it directly into my ear, a thought so simple yet so entirely devastating that I almost dropped my glass. What would happen if I didn't smile? Not just tonight, but ever again. What if I just stopped making it easy for them? What if I stopped filling the awkward silences and letting things slide and forgiving things that were never acknowledged? What if, instead of swallowing my anger, I let them choke on their own words for once? It's a dangerous question, the kind you don't ask unless you're ready to hear the answer, and the moment I allowed it to exist, the rules began to change. Not just for me, but for all of us. Because the truth was, they didn't know me. Not really. They knew the version of me I'd carefully maintained all these years, the agreeable one, the helper, the buffer, the one who remembered birthdays and brought napkins and left early so no one had to drive her home. They knew the Cassie who deflected attention, who let others take credit, who stayed small to keep the peace. But they didn't know the woman who had been keeping score, who remembered every overlooked achievement, every dismissed pain, every time she cried in her car after a holiday because she felt like a stranger at her own family table. And the terrifying, liberating thing was they'd never even thought to ask. I got up again, this time more slowly, deliberately. I told them I was grabbing the photo album from the den, and no one paid much attention except my mom, who glanced at me and said, "You're not gonna get sentimental again, are you?" in that tone she used when she wanted to warn me off from making things too serious. I smiled at her, tight-lipped, and said, "No, Mom. I just think it's good to remember things." The photo album wasn't a weapon. Not yet. It was just a prop, something to hold in my hands while I sorted through the anger taking shape in my chest. But as I flipped through those pages, I started seeing things differently. Photos that once made me nostalgic now seemed damning, not because of what they showed, but because of what they left out. My 8th birthday, Ben blowing out my candles. Senior prom, me standing alone at the edge of the frame, cropped out just enough to remind me who really mattered. Family vacations, Ben front and center, me in the back, often with a plate in my hands or a towel on my arm. I was always the one helping, never the one celebrated. And when I turned to the page with my college graduation photo, a grainy shot of me in my cap and gown, standing next to my mom because Dad couldn't get away from work and Ben was too hungover to make the drive, I felt it again, that hard click inside me, like a puzzle piece snapping into place. This wasn't bitterness. It wasn't jealousy. It was clarity. Cold, clean, and overdue. I carried the album back into the dining room, not with drama, not with a speech prepared, but with the casual energy of someone who's about to test how much silence a room can bear. I dropped it in the middle of the table, flipped it open to that graduation photo, and asked, "Hey, remember this day?" The room quieted a little. My dad squinted. Ben shrugged. Mom smiled politely. "Of course," she said. "You looked so pretty in that dress." I didn't look away from Dad as I spoke. "You weren't there, remember? You said you had a meeting. But I found out later you were at Ben's court date." The silence cracked, but no one filled it. "It's just interesting," I continued, still calm, still flipping the pages slowly, how often my milestones ended up being someone else's crisis. No one laughed this time. Not even Dad. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then closed it. Mom started to reach for my hand, the way she always did when she thought I might go too far, and I pulled it back gently. I didn't need comforting. Not anymore. Because something had changed. I wasn't here to explode or accuse or make a scene. I wasn't here to beg for validation or pick a fight. I was just here to remember out loud. And that, more than any shouting match, was enough to shift the energy in that room. I could feel it. The discomfort. The unease. The realization that maybe I hadn't come to play a game after all. I wasn't holding cards. I was holding truth. And no one, not even my father, had a good answer for that. And here's where I want to ask you something. If you'd been in my seat, watching the people who raised you laugh at your expense, knowing they would never respect what you did, who you were, what would you have done? Would you have walked away? Stayed quiet like always? Or would you have sat there with your glass of wine and your silent rage, just long enough to watch their world start to shift? Because I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't break anything or storm out. I just stopped trying to keep them comfortable. And that, it turns out, was the loudest thing I've ever done. There's a strange kind of liberation that comes the moment you stop caring whether the people you love ever truly understood you, not because it doesn't matter anymore, but because you finally understand they never tried and that truth, once accepted, is both a knife and a key. I sat at that dining table surrounded by the faces that had watched me grow up, that had shared dinners and holidays and matching flannel pajamas on Christmas Eve, and yet as I flipped through pages of the photo album, speaking casually about the forgotten or erased moments of my life, I realized I'd always been a visitor in this family, never a permanent resident, and certainly never someone they saw as worthy of real interest or concern. The conversation around the table had grown quieter, the usual buzz and banter softening into a kind of wary stillness that made every small sound, the clink of a glass, the creak of a chair, the shuffle of a foot under the table, feel suddenly louder, more pronounced, as if the house itself was trying to signal that something had shifted. My father no longer looked amused. His mouth, once curved into that smug, beer-flavored grin, had settled into a tight, skeptical line, like he was trying to calculate whether I was joking, testing him, or preparing to finally do the one thing I'd never done, fight back without smiling. Ben, for once, wasn't interrupting. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his eyes scanning me like I was a stranger who'd shown up at a party uninvited, wearing his sister's face, but speaking in a tone he'd never heard before. My mother kept rearranging the napkins in front of her, smoothing them out, folding and refolding them, clearly trying to redirect her hands since her words had abandoned her. I wasn't angry in the way they expected. There was no explosion, no tears, no desperate plea to be heard or seen. What I felt was deeper, older, and more calculated than that. It wasn't rage. It was reclamation. I'd spent decades carrying their secrets, their shames, their offhand cruelties like some family archivist no one had hired, but everyone relied on, and now I was finally beginning to realize I didn't owe them my silence any longer. I could unseal the vault any time I wanted. So I did. I flipped another page, this time revealing a photo from a summer barbecue, one where Aunt Linda had shown up with a black eye and a story about tripping on the steps, and I looked across the table at her, carefully watching the way her expression faltered just slightly before she pasted on a smile and reached for her drink. I said, "You remember this day, right? You brought that potato salad Ben still talks about." Her hand froze on the glass, but she nodded. "Sure, of course," she said, too quickly. "Great party." My voice stayed even. "I always wondered what really happened that morning. You told Mom you tripped, but I heard you and Uncle Ray arguing in the garage. You said, if you do that again, I swear I'll tell Frank." Her lips parted slightly, her eyes starting to my father's face. He didn't look at her. He just took a slow sip of his drink. I turned a page. A Christmas photo. Mom smiling, Dad holding a bourbon, Ben with his arms slung around me like we were the best of siblings. "This was the year Ben crashed my car," I said, tilting the album toward him. "Right before the holiday. You remember, don't you, Ben? You begged me not to tell Mom and Dad, said you couldn't afford another DUI. I took the blame. Paid the deductible. Said I forgot to put it in park. I looked at my mother now. You cried. You said you were so disappointed in me. And I let you believe it." Ben's smile, the cocky half-grin he wore like armor, slipped for the first time. "That was a long time ago," he muttered, but it sounded more like a warning than a defense. My father was no longer drinking. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the table, a habit I remembered from when he was trying to mask irritation, or more likely, panic. I looked down at the last photo in the album, a grainy one, probably taken with an old disposable Kodak, of Dad at a 4th of July cookout. His arm was around a woman who definitely wasn't my mother, though the photo had always been labeled as family friend Donna. The way he held her, the way she looked up at him, it didn't scream family friend to anyone who was paying attention. I traced my finger along the edge of the photo and said, without looking up, "You were with Donna a lot that summer. Remember? You took Ben and me to her cabin in Missouri. Mom said she couldn't go because she was sick, but we were there for 3 days. I finally met his eyes. You told us not to say anything about the late nights or the fact that you and Donna went for drives every evening. You gave me that $10 bill to stay quiet." No one breathed. Aunt Linda looked like she might be sick. My mother had gone completely still. My father cleared his throat. "That's enough, Cassie," he said, but his voice didn't have the usual authority. It sounded thin, fragile, human. I closed the album and rested my hands on top of it. "Is it?" No one responded. There were no more jokes. No more trivia questions. No more smug jabs. They didn't know what to do with me now that I wasn't smiling, now that I wasn't deflecting or absorbing the damage. They didn't recognize this version of me, the one who remembered everything, the one who had carried their secrets not because she was weak, but because she believed that was what love required. But something had changed. I no longer mistook silence for strength or forgiveness for peace. I had been quiet for so long they forgot I had a voice. That mistake was theirs. Correcting it was mine. And so I sat there, letting the silence stretch, letting them stew in the discomfort they had so often handed me without a second thought. No yelling. No melodrama. Just memory. Just truth. Because the truth has a way of sounding louder when it's finally spoken by someone who was never allowed to speak. And they were only just beginning to hear me. There's a peculiar, almost chemical shift that occurs inside you the moment you finally stop seeking permission to feel what you feel, when the years of muting yourself in the name of keeping the peace collapse under their own weight, leaving behind only the raw, unfiltered sensation of clarity. That night, as the air in the dining room grew thick with everything left unsaid, and the once steady hum of conversation fell away into a careful, stifled quiet, I found myself recognizing something I'd never truly understood before. That I had never really been part of this family in the way I was told I was, that I had always functioned more like emotional insulation, something soft and quiet between other people's explosions, absorbing the tension, hiding the cracks, making sure nothing ever truly shattered until now. They had expected a tantrum, a breakdown, some dramatic outburst fueled by wine and middle-child resentment. But instead, what they got was silence weaponized, truth presented plainly, without malice or apology, in the tone of someone who wasn't trying to win an argument, but simply had nothing left to lose. And that, I think, was more terrifying to them than anything I could have screamed. I stayed seated for a while after the album was closed, letting the weight of the moment settle in the room like smoke. I watched as Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing toward the kitchen like he might escape into it, as Ben reached for his phone, then hesitated, uncertain whether doing so would make him look like a coward, as my mother tried, futilely, to arrange her features into something resembling composure, blinking just a little too often and clinging to her wine glass like a lifeline. Aunt Linda, who had always been the family's emotional antenna, its self-appointed protector of old stories and old loyalties, sat completely still, her hand hovering near her mouth, as if she were trying to keep her own words from slipping out, afraid of what might come with them. And I, the quiet one, the helpful one, the dependable one, simply sat and watched, absorbing the silence like a woman measuring a room before a controlled demolition. It was in that thick, charged stillness that the idea formed, not impulsive, not vengeful, but deliberate. I didn't need to yell or accuse or demand. I didn't even need to tell them what they'd done wrong. All I had to do was drop a few carefully placed matches into the dry brush of their secrets, the little truths they thought were buried in the dust of time or dismissed as harmless missteps. Because the truth is, people don't usually unravel from the big things. It's the small ones, the quiet revelations, the barely whispered reminders that everything they built was balanced on lies they told themselves and each other. And no one lies more thoroughly than a family trying to protect its own image. So I excused myself, claiming I needed to use the bathroom, and left the table without waiting for anyone to speak. Once in the hallway, I pulled out my phone and opened my email, tapping out a short message to my mother, no explanation, no emotion, just an attachment titled Wells Fargo, Joint Savings Withdrawals, 2018 to 2021. A spreadsheet I'd stumbled across months ago while helping her reset her online banking access. She hadn't asked for a breakdown then, and I hadn't offered one. But tonight, it felt like the right time to remind her of the $10,000 that vanished in small, quiet pieces, money she thought was mismanaged, but which was, in fact, rerouted. Some of it went to Donna M. Reynolds, a name my mother had never dared to speak out loud. Next, I opened a group message, one I wasn't part of but had access to nonetheless. Ben and his wife, Melissa, had added me years ago to a thread for holiday planning, then forgotten I was still included. I typed a single sentence. Melissa, you ever ask Ben about that Vegas weekend in March 2021? No details. Just the nudge. Just enough to flick the first domino. Then I pulled up my call log, scrolled to Aunt Linda, and hit the voicemail button. I didn't script it. I didn't need to. My voice was calm, almost bored, as I said, "Hey Linda, I was thinking about that conversation you and I had years ago, you remember, the one about Dad and Donna? It's been on my mind. You said if Mom ever found out, it'd destroy her. Just wondering if you ever told her. Or if you ever told Dad that you knew." I paused, then added, "Anyway. Hope you're doing okay. See you next Thursday." I returned to the table with a soft smile, offering no explanation, and poured myself another half-glass of wine. The trivia cards had been put away. Dad was fidgeting with his ring, twisting it around his finger with the restless energy of a man who could feel the air shifting, but didn't yet understand why. Ben was muttering something to himself, eyes flicking to his phone. My mother's hands were in her lap now, clenched tightly, the wine glass untouched. I didn't say a word about the emails or the voicemail. I didn't need to. Because the moment you plant truth in a room like that, it grows fast, wild, and unmanageable, and people will hear what they want to hear, believe what they're most afraid might be true, and react not to the facts, but to the weight of their own conscience. It started slowly at first. A buzz on my mother's phone, her brows knitting as she read something in silence. Then Ben's phone lit up, and the color drained from his face. Aunt Linda stepped outside for a quick call and didn't return for 20 minutes. My father looked from face to face, trying to decipher the pattern, but the one person he didn't watch was me. Because he still didn't believe I was capable of this. Because he thought the way I'd stayed quiet all these years meant I would never push back. Because people like him can't imagine that silence is sometimes not a weakness, but a strategy. And that when someone finally speaks, not with volume but with precision, it doesn't matter how long they waited, the impact is immediate. By the time dessert was served, no one was hungry. My mother stood up from the table and quietly excused herself, muttering something about needing rest. Ben was already on his phone, fingers moving rapidly, his voice sharp when Melissa finally called back. Aunt Linda returned with red eyes and a damp tissue, saying she had a headache. Dad looked around the room, confused and increasingly isolated, but too proud to admit that he felt the ground shifting beneath him. And I finished my wine, complimented the brownies, and began gathering empty plates as though nothing had happened, as though I hadn't just dropped 3 bombs in the middle of their dinner table. As though the fire wasn't already spreading behind every glance and every text and every panicked thought they were too afraid to speak aloud. Because revenge, when it's real, doesn't look like rage. It doesn't come with shouting or broken dishes. It comes with silence, with calm, with carefully unwrapped memories and truths delivered so gently you almost don't realize how deeply they cut until the bleeding starts. And by the time they realized what I'd done, I was already gone. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a storm, not the peaceful, fresh kind that comes after a summer rain, but the heavy, unnatural stillness that settles over a space when the damage is still being surveyed and no one's quite sure what to say or whether it's already too late to say anything at all. And that was exactly the kind of silence I felt echoing through my phone as I sat on the worn sofa in my apartment later that night, the living room dark except for the soft orange glow of a single table lamp, a glass of cheap red wine resting on the armrest, untouched, not because I wasn't thirsty, but because I wasn't finished thinking. I hadn't turned on the TV. I hadn't played music. I hadn't even kicked off my shoes. I just sat there in the aftershock, watching my phone light up with messages I had no intention of opening, at least not yet, each notification a faint vibration against my thigh, each one another ripple from the stone I'd dropped into the still pond of our so-called family dynamic. A stone no bigger than a sentence, a suggestion, a half-remembered truth spoken without warning or remorse. I didn't expect the call from Aunt Linda, not exactly, but I wasn't surprised either when her name lit up my screen just before midnight, her number still saved under the same contact name I'd given it years ago, Linda the Loyal. Back when I still believed loyalty was about covering for people, when I still thought protecting secrets made you good, made you kind, made you worthy of love. I let the phone ring once, twice, then answered it on the third, my voice calm, almost distant, like I'd been expecting a weather report, not a sobbing aunt on the other end of the line asking a question I wasn't entirely sure how to answer. "What did you say to him?" Her voice was thick, cracked with exhaustion and panic and something that almost sounded like guilt, and for a second I almost softened, almost fell into the familiar pattern of soothing her, calming her down, pretending I didn't know exactly what she meant. But I didn't. I let the question sit there, heavy and unanswered, and I let her feel the weight of her own words before I responded. When I finally did speak, my voice was quiet but unshaking, and I said only this: "I told the truth, Linda. That's all I ever did." She went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't really silence, but rather the sound of someone realizing just how much of their past they've spent trying to rewrite in order to survive it. Then she whispered something that didn't sound like it was meant for me at all. "He said he was just trying to protect you." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how absurdly familiar that excuse was. How many times over the years I'd been told that cruelty was protection, that silence was safety, that neglect was love in disguise. I said nothing. What could I say that wouldn't make her unravel even more? Across the room, the light from a passing car swept across the floor like a moving shadow, and for a moment, I imagined my father still sitting at that table, staring at his phone in disbelief, wondering how a daughter he'd underestimated for 4 decades had managed to rip through his carefully maintained narrative without raising her voice or even leaving her seat. He would be angry, of course, angrier than I'd ever seen him, but not at me, not truly. He'd be angry at the fact that it worked, that I'd finally done something impressive, and that it wasn't anything he could measure or dismiss with a joke. He would rage at the idea that his grip had slipped, not just on the family, but on the version of reality he'd spent so long curating with sarcasm and superiority. My mother hadn't called. Not yet. But I'd seen her read the email. The read receipt came through 2 hours after I sent it. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. I could picture her sitting on the edge of her bed in that robe she always wore after dinner, the one with the faded collar and the missing belt, clutching the tablet she barely knew how to use, staring at the numbers and the names, trying to convince herself that it wasn't real, that someone had hacked the account, that there was a mistake, but there wasn't. There were just choices and consequences, and a daughter who had stopped making excuses for either. Ben, naturally, had tried to shift the blame. He sent a text earlier that night, 3 full paragraphs laced with faux concern, forced levity, and veiled accusations. He wrote, "You really blindsided everyone tonight. I don't know what's going on with you, but maybe you should talk to someone." As if therapy could unwind the years he spent standing on my shoulders, collecting praise for achievements he barely earned, while I stayed quiet, made room, and clapped at all the right times. I didn't answer. Not because I couldn't, but because some messages don't deserve a reply. Some people only hear echoes of themselves anyway. I leaned back into the cushions, finally allowing my body to relax, the tension I'd carried through dinner slowly dissolving into something else, something like satisfaction, but not quite. It wasn't joy. It wasn't revenge in the dramatic, cinematic sense. It was the kind of quiet, deep knowing that settles into your bones when you realize that for the first time, you've stepped out of the role they wrote for you and spoken your lines without asking for their applause. And yet, even in that moment, I knew this wasn't the end. Not really. Families like mine don't implode in a single night. They fracture, slowly and quietly, over weeks and months, in uncomfortable phone calls, in missed holidays, in the awkward space left by someone who no longer plays their part. I wouldn't be disinvited. That's not how my mother operates. I would be reabsorbed, recorded, reassigned a gentler version of the truth I'd just appended. There would be attempts to move on, to put it behind us, to start fresh, but I wouldn't play along. Not this time. Because it was never about punishing them. It wasn't even about getting even. It was about saying, clearly and finally, I saw everything. I remember everything. And I will no longer carry it quietly. The next morning would come. The texts would pile up. Some would apologize. Some would deny. Some would beg. But I would not go back. I would not explain. I would not soften the truth for their comfort. And when the holidays rolled around, and the table was set, and my seat was left open or awkwardly reassigned, they would feel the absence, not because they missed me, but because they missed the role I played, the one that kept them safe from themselves. Some truths don't burn. They haunt. And mine had only just begun to echo.